Ways and means, we're still here. It's 10 something, I have no idea, 9:15. And we are starting our yield bill. We are ahead of schedule for the day. I know we're only an hour something into the day, but I'm still gonna brag about it. And hope this is the kind of careful yet efficient work we can get done today. Coming back to our yield bill again. Wondering if anyone had thoughts overnight that they would like to discuss, anything anyone would like to hear from Julia. They did not hear yesterday. Yes, Representative Odie.
I still agree with myself that.
Oh, I love that for you.
The most important thing, well, I have three things to say. One, we haven't done anything really hard, like to try to cut some things from, so that we could, with cuts or changes to how we do things, we could actually save taxpayers money. Like we could look at early college. Or we could look at, something was mentioned yesterday, I can't remember it. But then that's one area. Then the second thing is, yes, I think that considering what might happen at the federal level, I think it's really responsible to take the 77 million and hold it. Because maybe if our constituents knew what we know, that having some money set aside to meet needs that might not otherwise be able to be met, that would be a very responsible tack to take. But then my third thing was, well, wait a minute, if the governor's been talking about bringing the average bill down to 1%, and we don't put that out, if we don't act and say, yep, we'll use the 77 to bring down taxes, then politically we'll be accused of keeping taxes high, raising taxes on people that he would like to put down. So, those are three things that I just thought I'd say.
Thanks. I feel like we sort of a longstanding committee norm of
Not talking about the government.
not talking about sort of
Sorry.
to some extent, like
When
I
I
think
said
it's
that, I
hard.
thought maybe I should.
I understand people talk about I think it's appropriate to talk about the governor's budget
Correct.
or bills, the governor, right? Like the administration's bills. I think speculating about the governor's opinion on anything is
Okay.
maybe not gonna get us. I think it could get us into our own
All right.
spinning that
I'm
it's not
sorry.
helpful for anyone. So we can always have someone from the administration come in and speak to anything if that's what we would like to do to understand the governor's perspective.
All right. Yeah, sorry.
No, absolutely.
But what I'm just thinking is, just in that general vein, is
So if you would like
we don't
to,
offer something that.
yes, so I guess I'm wondering if you would like to remove early college from the education fund, are you proposing that the program is removed, or are you proposing that it is moved to the general fund?
Ah.
And if so, what are the consequences of that?
For the details on that, I don't have.
We are voting on Friday, so the details need to be figured out today, if that's something you want to do.
Let me give it some.
Great, thank you. Representative Maslin.
Yeah, I think early college has great merit. We can talk about it. I would not be opposed. As a matter of fact, I'd be in favor of moving to general fund. So it's not paid through local property taxes, which is inappropriate. But I would be very much opposed to scuttling.
So if folks want to, yes, Representative Wajda.
I was just gonna sort of following up on my comments from yesterday. I am still feeling as if the voters passed their budgets with the things that we are currently funding through the education fund still included in the education fund. And I think that we're having a lot of really big conversations about what the future of the structure of the education fund looks like, how we pay for it, how we bring money in, how we send money out. And removing anything from the education fund at this point in our work feels like it's just going to make our work harder down the line and might lead to folks not being on the same page about what we're actually talking about paying through the education fund. So I think holding on to the 77 million, or even, splitting, using half of the 77 million for some property tax relief, holding on to the other half, because who knows what's coming from Washington, is a bad idea. But I don't think that we should be at this juncture removing anything from the education fund. I think that everything is on the table in the long term, and we'll get policy recommendations from House Ed, but I don't think moving anything out of the education fund at this point is a good move.
I think there could be unintended consequences that we have not reckoned.
Mhm.
Representative Nelson?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your saying policy choices. I mean, I could go on for a paragraph on why I think early college is a good idea. But I recognize there are limits to what we can do in this committee, and our timelines are necessarily annoying from time to time. I don't know what else to say. But I'm not sure when is an appropriate and appropriate time to remove things from the ed fund. Those decisions need to be sorted out, I think. But I think I understand you to say for this year, we're a little late to have that discussion because it's going to be longer than just a trip around the table. Yes. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you. I guess in regards to the $77 million, I've in my reports, and we generally have at our legislative breakfast, 2 representatives and 1 senator speak. And I was the representative this past Monday that spoke. I mentioned that again in my discussion about $77 million that the governor was recommending. So I certainly feel that I've supported that, and I think the constituency that I was talking to certainly understood what was happening, and I think you're right. If it was not all in there, it would be looked at as we're looking at raising taxes again on property taxes, which, right or wrong, that's the impression that I think I would get from my constituency. This is my 17th year. My 17th year of having legislative breakfast. There was most people that were ever there and the most disrespect that I've ever seen, which was really concerning for me. It was across the board with different subjects, whether it was school meals, whether it was federal funding, reductions, which we have no control over at this point. But anyway, I guess I'll stop there. But again, my personal feeling is to keep the 77 million.
Like,
In there to do what with?
in there to buy a down rate?
To buy down the rates.
Yes, yeah, I'm sorry.
And so I'm concerned about the hole, whether we want to call it 1 hole or 2 holes, for next year. And the reality that probably we won't have as much unexpected revenue last year as we do this year. And so what that's going to look like next year for tax rate. And so that's the one concern that I want to make sure that we're really reckoning with. And I think it's a good reason to split it across 2 years into a reserve fund. But I don't, that's where I'm sitting with this right now. And so I have not heard it. So right now it seems like we have some broad consensus on homestead and non-homestead changing at the same. Okay.
Mhm.
So I appreciate you throwing the other argument into the room. That was kind of you.
No problem.
Okay, yes.
I just want to say that we need to remember that not all schools have been approved. School budgets have been approved.
Mhm.
There are 9 across the state that have not been approved still. So those voters matter. And looking at this outlook, there are other things in here that we could leave to local voters or cut. And Carol and I had a good talk in the hallway yesterday about that we need to make choices. I don't think it's too early to cut. I think this is the end of March, and we've got to get going on these decisions. No one wants to make these decisions, but we have to do that. Whether the budget was approved this year or not, the voters have sent us a message. Think of last year. Where were we sitting last year? That could happen again. I think there's an understanding on the part of the voters that we will do something significant and that this is a transition year, but something significant is going to happen in the near future. So I'm looking at transportation. And I'm looking at, some of these things we can't cut. Again, for example, but the small schools grant, it's only a little over 1 million, but it's something. And actually, those are the schools that are the problem here with, remaining small. Flexible pathways, universal school meals, although I want that. These are decisions nobody wants to make. But I think we need to talk about it and get it out on the table. And then look at the, what if we do this, what would happen kind of scenario. Well, I'm the mean old grandmother today, no fooling around, so.
I also feel like a mean old grandmother too.
I will make you all Rachel Kennedy.
I'm not, you don't need, like, we can wait. You don't need to rush. It's fine. We need it whenever it shows up. Representative Holcomb.
I think, appreciate you saying that, and I realize these are really hard choices, and I think the challenge I'm having with buying down is every time we buy down, we interrupt the only signal local voters have about the impact of their decisions, because they go expecting this 5.98 or whatever it is local increase, and then they don't get it. So then the impact is, oh, I voted for that, but there's no consequence to that vote. And you can't, I think, so I don't think we want to interrupt that signal as hard as it feels. I also have seen us cycle between, it's almost like a bulimic pivot where we fund buying down.
Did you say bulimic?
No, bulimic, like we
Bulimic.
starve and.
That is in fact what you said. Okay.
Yes, and then the next year, we force them to starve because we bought them down the year before, and it just feels like a very unhealthy cycle, which prevents long-term planning. It's the same way I feel about short-term caps, like when we put in these short-term caps on spending, what we saw is everyone negotiated 3-year leases that got them out beyond the first 2 years. Districts need to plan for long-term, and every time we do these short-term gimmicks, we actually erode their managerial leadership. And I think that's just super, super risky. There are things that we could do that are shorter term. I agree with you. I feel like we're acting like it's all on school districts to constrain costs. I think it's also on us. And, you know, one example I shared with you this morning, I agree we need to deal with pensions, but we also need to be realistic about the fact that we shoved a lot more costs on the school districts for that. Even that alone, we're spending about $50 million more a year just on OPEB and teacher pensions. I support that, but that is a real 5-cent increase in cost, and we could just keep going from there. And my point is, we are responsible too. And when we're asking districts to cut like heck, what are we doing to make good decisions? We are eroding scale at the top, the end, and the middle of the system. We are funding early college. 6% of kids in senior year last year unenrolled from high school to enroll in early college. Much of it is virtual college, not bricks and mortar college. And those are kids that we're not paying for twice because the districts can't budget to reduce teachers to compensate for an unpredictable number of kids who opt out. So we pay to retain the capacity in the public system, and we also pay for the early college. At the bottom level, we didn't just say we're going to do universal pre-K. We said we're going to do universal pre-K vouchers. We have school districts that have lost 40% of their kids. If they were allowed to provide pre-K in their building, they could achieve significant efficiencies of scale in those buildings. But we actually prevent them from doing that in statute. So they are forced to deliver that in a more expensive, less efficient way. That's a policy choice that we made, not districts. And we could just say, if the pre-K is provided someplace outside the school setting, it gets picked up by Act 76, which is a parallel funding source. And that would reduce right off the top about $1.4 million in the ed fund. It's not a lot, but it's 14 million in the ed fund, which is about 1.5 cents. So the point is, there are things that we could do that would signal that we're in this with school districts. This isn't just on school districts, that we understand that we're part of the problem too. And we're going to make some decisions that are hard decisions. Here's another one. We support you. I'm sorry, but we, instead of working up the efficient 21C program, last time data was available, 40% of the kids in 21C after school were economically disadvantaged. 4% of kids in the private providers were economically disadvantaged. Instead of strengthening 21C and partnerships that allowed for more efficient use of existing infrastructure, we set up a special fund, took those dollars out of the fund again and sent it off to private childcare, including building brand new capacity when we already have unused capacity sitting in buildings. We may think it's better, but we can't do that and say cost is one of our considerations because we have empty buildings after 3 and in the summer that could have been used for those programs. So I think we have to decide, and we have to also be transparent. If we are choosing to dilute our public investment, we need to acknowledge that affordability is not a priority. So I have trouble with this. I have huge problems with buying it down, because we have not done anything that I've seen that's substantive to try to get ahead of the cost curve here. And I also feel like we're making choices that are expensive, and maybe we need to own some of that and make some hard choices about what it looks like to support good opportunities for kids, but in a way that makes better use of our existing infrastructure and capabilities and does it at a lower price point. Because I don't think, I can't go back to my taxpayers and say, I'm raising your taxes, and by the way, quite significantly due to weights, which I also think are inappropriately applied. And I'm not going to encourage anything at the state level. It's just, we're in this too. It's not just them.
So I think we are all of those points are incredibly valid. And we are engaging in a massive education transformation process that we're doing very carefully that I believe will address many, many of those things. What we're talking about is funding for 3 months from now. And we have a fairly unstable system, and removing tranches of money from that system with no warning violates a trust that we have between the legislature and the school board. And throughout this year, we've given sort of regular assurances that we're not going to mess with this upcoming fiscal year. In my conversations with education leaders, they see the transfer of general fund dollars as evidence that we have a stake in the issue, or we're taking responsibility for the issue. For better or for worse, I don't, the money is all fungible. I think it's interesting that people do perceive it that way, but the general fund transfer is seen by districts as a way of sort of the General Assembly saying, like, we are also responsible for this spending.
But it's on a credit card.
Sure, yes, it's on a, yeah. So I'm gonna ask Julia to come and join us and talk.
Because I think you're speaking to something I said. With respect, some of us have been asking for us to address some of these issues for years.
Yeah.
At some point, we have to start addressing.
I think that's what we're planning to do in the education transformation bill.
None of the issues I've heard, I just mentioned have been addressed in the transformation. So I'm hoping they are.
I'm gonna ask you to take responsibility for making sure some of those are addressed in the education transformation bill.
I actually will reject that because I find that that's not how things work around here in the State House. I can't be responsible if people aren't interested.
Representative Maslin.
Very briefly, I'm all with you on pre-K. How we get there, I don't know. My concern about early college is my concern, broadly speaking, that if some of those kids don't get a taste of college, they'll never go to post-secondary education. I mean, we know that from the Vermont State College's experience. And so somehow, in our broader discussion, we need to figure out more specifically, more broadly, how to get kids from high school into post-secondary education, because it's very important for us economically in the state of Vermont.
That would be through enrollment, which is much more cost effective and treats the population that you're talking
We can
about. Yeah.
have a good discussion too. Thank you.
Julia. Hello. Hi.
Morning.
Can you talk about some of those rows and what happens when we?
Sure. I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. Do you want me to pull something up on the screen or do you want me to just talk?
Whatever feels better for your communication.
Okay, well, I guess I can just sort of provide some level setting conversation about the education fund, the pieces in it, and thinking specifically about these appropriation lines and the categorical aid lines. I don't think anything I'm saying is new, and may be helpful in terms of centering the conversation. So one piece that I think is important to note is the vast majority of school budgets have been passed or have been built at this point. So those school budgets do assume the full funding of all of the lines that we're looking here in the education fund. So we've spoken about universal school meals, right? That school budgets are assuming the provision of universal school meals. In previous testimony, the other lines are also fair to assume as well. These are statutory categorical aid programs that school districts have assumed in their budget building process. So if one of these line items were to be cut and not from the education fund and not funded in another manner, then there would be a hole in school district budgets corresponding with whatever is being cut for the upcoming fiscal year. Another piece I wanted to note is thinking about a sense of scale and what we're looking at within the education fund. A general benchmark is that about 14 million is 1 penny on both the homestead and the non-homestead property tax rate. So when thinking about, for instance, I don't want to call out any lines specifically, but there's a number of lines that when we're looking at within the appropriations between lines 13 and 23, there's a number of lines there that are less than 14 million, in fact, less than 10 million. So that means that cutting those lines and creating that hole in those budgets does not correspond with a penny on the tax rates. It's a policy choice, of course. And when thinking about sense of scale and really what's moving the needle, a couple of million is not going to be moving the needle on property taxes. So those were a couple pieces I wanted to mention. Final piece, or I guess I'll pause there. I have a couple other comments, but I don't know if there's
Any questions for Julia? And I really I hope this conversation folks can really bring into the education transformation conversation, because we need to do all the things we're talking about. And we have a fairly unstable system. It feels, it's incredible that so many school budgets pass. They pass because of some really hard decisions that might not be great for kids in some cases. And so we need to make sure that we're not further destabilizing the system while we engage in transformation, which cuts with a 3-month notice might do. And we need to make sure that we are changing those pieces for the future. And categorical aid is a big part of that. I know I just gave a monologue and I want to make sure we're focused on Julia, and I'm going to ask Julia to leave the chair if no one has anything for Julia. Yes.
Could you also provide us with a list, not of direct expenditures out of the ed fund, but a list of tax expenditures, however you want to call them, things that are foregone revenues that you've chosen in statute to not?
Absolutely. Off the top of my head, it won't be exhaustive. We do have the tax expenditure report that spells out a number of them, but those are also pieces like current use, which is a significant tax expenditure. We have the property tax credit included in here. Also, any exemption to sales and use tax, that's going to be foregone revenue. Sales and use tax is 100% dedicated to the education fund. So all of those exemptions are foregone revenue to the education fund.
And I know Representative Kimball has been working with the Ag Committee to try to help them move their way through some current use exploration. Is that well phrased?
They're pursuing a couple of different possibilities, yes. They're finding it difficult to make some of the adjustments that they thought were simple. In terms of the administration, they taken testimony from many different town clerks and how to administer changes in the current use program. So I don't know that that's finished, but that's what I've learned.
And the TIF, we're gonna spend some real time on TIF after crossover. Back to you, Julia, sorry.
Yes, absolutely. I think TIF is another one that I mentioned, of course, an expansion of TIF or some sort of expansions or capping of real estate values moving forward. We rely on growth in the grand list. So for instance, included in these projections that we're looking at here, you know, for fiscal year 24, fiscal year 26, we've got grand list growth forecasted to be 14%. Any sort of cap against that growth or holding on to those revenues is growth that cannot be used for the purpose of raising property taxes. But I'm not the TIF expert, that's Ted. A couple other pieces that I think may be helpful to include in the conversation, going back to the question of, you know, these appropriations, these categorical aid specific line items. I also want to note that while we do have all of these categorical aid programs and line items called out, these line items are not representing the full cost of those specific needs in school district budgets. So for instance, looking at special education aid, we see the special education categorical aid, but we also see special ed costs being borne within the education payment line. The same holds true for transportation, tech ed, all of these other lines here. So that's also an important piece to keep in mind, that with making changes, it's not necessarily making change to one line. That's what we talked about for universal meals. If you were to repeal universal school meals and school districts were to choose to maintain it or not, there would be additional costs borne with it. I have one related, because I find Outlook, but unrelated maybe to the conversation you've had so far, about the surplus, if you want me to get into that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
So yesterday there was a conversation about if there were to not be any education fund surplus used to buying down property taxes, what would that look like? Right, so centering us in line 40 of the Ed Fund Outlook, we have that Ed Fund surplus of 41 million. So last night I modeled if that 41 million were to not be used and just parked somewhere else or put in a reserve or whatever, what that would look like. And if it were to be uniformly raised on the homestead and non-homestead, that would correspond with an average bill increase of 8.2%. So instead of the 5.8 that we're looking at here in column D, it would move up to an 8.2% without that Ed Fund surplus.
That was a question you had yesterday, Representative Bodie? Thanks. Thank you, Julia.
Could you just say that last part again? 41 million, if we didn't use that to buy down property tax rates, just left it in the kitty, what would it do to the tax rates?
It would be an average bill change of 8.2%.
Okay,
And that's if it were to be, I modeled it uniform because that seemed to be what the committee was interested in understanding.
thank you. Yeah.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
So is that an additional 8, or, because then you said that something about the 5%. So is it really 3% or is it 8?
Will you pull up the outlook?
Sure. It's an increase to 8, so it's not an additional 8%, but I will pull up the outlook to clarify.
I'm still not happy about that, but it's not quite so bad.
It's not all new.
Yeah.
Bear with me. Okay. So what I did was,
There we go. Okay. Yep.
okay. So what I did is here, this column D. This is assuming that there's no general fund transfer. And a uniform bill change, and that corresponds with an average bill increase of 5.8%. The question yesterday was, well, we're using this 41 million.
Wait, before you finish that sentence, so that's essentially the December 1st letter.
Correct. The December 1st letter, all of the parameters of how to solve are spelled out in statute, and one of those parameters is that all education fund surplus needs to be used uniformly for buying down taxes. After the December 1 letter, that is moot. You all can choose to do whatever you want to do. But that reflects the December 1st letter parameters, yes. So that 41 million is used to uniformly buy down taxes. Yesterday, the question was, what if we didn't use the 41 million in ed fund surplus? Then what would it look like? And so that's what I did last night. And it would be about a 2.5% increase on top of the 5.8. So an overall average bill change of 8.2%. So here, I didn't do a new ed fund outlook because I thought that might just make things more confusing. But it would be, if I were to, the only change here would be to the yields and the rates, and the average bill change here would say 8.2.
As long as we're here, Julia, can you remind me what that line, statewide adjustment is? 71%. What is that?
Sure. So that's your average statewide CLA. That was the change that was made in last year's yield bill. So if a district has a local CLA of 72.4%, then their equalized tax rate will not need to be adjusted by the CLA because they're the statewide average. So we're already benchmarking against the statewide average. That's why we're seeing that significant, what looks to be a significant change between FY25 and FY26 in rates and yields. But a lot of that is just the change in methodology of what we are doing on the back end.
So Julia, line, row D, this is what you worked with, so there's also no 77.2 million.
Correct. So for column D, all of these, there's no 77.2 million. You see that lack of the 77.2 on row 8. If you put in the 77.2 million and all of it is used for the purpose of uniformly lowering taxes, you see that in column D with an average bill change of 1.1% increase. And moving further down the line, column G says, okay, we're doing the 77.2 million general fund transfer. We're using half of it for rates this year. We're putting half of it into a reserve. And that corresponds with an estimated average bill increase of 3.5%.
Reduction.
Increase. All of the columns in this Ed Fund Outlook see either a 0% average bill increase or an increase. There's nothing on this outlook that I've presented here that shows a decrease in your average property tax bill.
And correspondingly, if we don't use that 41 million surplus from the year before, all of these would be increased by this approximate 3%.
Exactly.
Julie, and I know you explained this a while back too, but in looking at all of those, using that, well, I guess there's a bit of a change. The 72.4% of the state's common level of appraisal, correct? So those figures up at the top have to be adjusted by that 20-some% decrease, is that right?
So all of the, so the statewide adjustment, the average CLA, I've included it here for folks to know the numbers that are going into the modeling, and all of the rates and yields I've already adjusted by that 72 0.4 statewide CLA. That's why we're seeing for instance, the average homestead property tax rate in here. These are all equalized, right? So it's pre-local CLA.
Pretty local, okay.
So in FY 25, we didn't have that statewide adjustment. We were benchmarking to 100% of fair market value. So there was a much wider swing between the pre-CLA rate and the post-local CLA rate. In FY 26, we are benchmarking against the statewide average, which is why you're seeing, you know, that 30+ cent difference, but not the corresponding bill change, because we are benchmarking against the average.
Okay, I think, thanks.
We really need that. We really need that, some of the adjustments to CLA.
We do indeed, Representative Campbell. Thank you for asking. Yeah. Certainly not changing it right now.
Fair.
We did a lot of fun stuff last year when you weren't here.
Yeah.
Lesson learned. Okay, thank you very much, Julia. Yeah.
So I think that what we're really reckoning with, whether it's talking about using the surplus, whether it's talking about a general fund transfer, is we're not being, I feel, truly honest about the actual cost of education in the state of Vermont. It is expensive. Our education system is expensive. There's no denying that. When we talk about, you know, the inefficiencies that are built into some of our education system, and I don't disagree with Representative Holcomb that those are there, and we should be working to address it. But when we just start talking about cutting things, all of these budgets that have passed, there have been hundreds of teaching positions cut across the state. Kids aren't going on field trips. Classes are getting cut. It is the kids. Whenever we talk about cutting anything to save money, it is the kids at the end of the day who are being hurt the most by those cuts. As we're going through this education transformation work, we should be addressing the inefficiencies that exist. We should be talking about why our healthcare costs for teachers are going up so much while our healthcare executives are getting six-figure bonus checks every year. All of those things need to be addressed. But for me, it's always about the end result of the education system. The end result of the education system, meaning the experiences, the opportunities that our kids are being offered. So when we talk about early college, you know, does that make it more expensive for high schools to operate? Yeah, sure. But it's opportunities that are being offered to kids. And I am more than happy to spend money to offer children more opportunities and give them the services and the resources that they need to be successful in the out years. And so I think we have to be honest about the true cost of education, which I think the general fund transfer blurs those lines. And I think that the fundamental problem, what I heard over the course of the election season, what I heard over the course of the last year, was not that our education system was too expensive. It's that the way we are paying for it is broken, putting so much of a burden on property taxpayers in 2025 just does not make sense. The education funding system that we have as currently structured is built off of systems that were put in place 150 to 200 years ago. And we just have to catch up to what the world is like in 2025. The poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer. And until we can address that underlying dynamic, to talk about cutting different programs just does not make any sense to me. And I think that, you know, we're not going to address that by Friday when we have to vote this bill out. We have an obligation to support our current education system, and that current education system is expensive, but we have to do it. That is our obligation, and those are hard decisions that we have to make. And listen, I'm from one of the communities that have the highest percentage of renters, that have one of the highest levels of poverty in Washington County. I understand that the affordability crunch is extremely real, which is why we also have to have conversations about raising wages. But we cannot be undermining the services and the resources that our kids are getting offered in the name of affordability, because we can't be making the choice between affordability and supporting students.
think one thing that doesn't come up very often is also all the money that we spend, the vast majority of money we spend in schools is actually money that stays in Vermont. And is often spent very quickly in Vermont, which is, I think, sort of a difference between, say, the hospital, the healthcare system, right? Where a lot of it might go out of state for pharmaceutical costs. Like salaries in healthcare there's areas of the state where I think like huge percentage of the healthcare benefits is come from the school district, which I think is interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, Representative Holcomb.
Yeah, I think in Essex County, actually, it's about probably 40% of people get their health benefits through the school system. I 100% agree with you on a lot of what you're saying. I worry that in Vermont, sometimes under the ruse of equity, we promote programs that are actually not equitable. And I think early college is one of those. If you look at who is involved in early college compared to who is involved in dual enrollment, it is much less equitable. And, talk to the person at Slate Valley, one of the school districts we keep talking about. The kids who are going off to early college tend to be more privileged and they don't have disabilities. So we're starving the ability of the school to provide for the more disabled and less economically advantaged kids who are there on site. That's not equitable. And unless we're having data-informed conversations, I don't feel comfortable governing based on the feeling that it's better. If it was better, really expanding opportunities and getting more kids involved in college, we would have seen that. We could provide a lot more access to college for kids in high school through dual enrollment at a much lower price point than early college. We have to be able to have those conversations. I agree with you. I'm not talking about cutting services. I just know that if school districts didn't pay for the kids in private pre-K, they'd be picked up by the Act 76 vouchers. We have an alternative funding source which diversifies it. We don't need to do it this year. If we don't, what I want is some indication that we're going to do it, because for 3 years now, we keep saying we're going to not deal with it, we're not going to deal with it, we're not going to deal with it. And I hear you on investing in Vermont, but when we invest in, Phillips Exeter Academy, those dollars are permanently lost to the Vermont economy. We can't even talk about that openly in the legislature. I do believe in investing in Vermont schools, and I believe in getting to scale, or we can't provide reasonable opportunities for some of our kids. But we pass a lot of stuff that the impact is actually not equitable, and it is erosive of our ability to provide good opportunities to kids. And I just would caution us on that front.
And I don't disagree substantively with the things you just said. I just don't feel like that's the question that's in front of us right now.
I think that I agree. And I think the question is, if we just go through again, and I don't know what we're going to do with the 77, I think we're stuck with the 41. But if we don't signal any other way that we're actually quite serious about structural reform and it needs to start, we're still 2 years out from any impact. Because we haven't signaled. And every year we say we can't do it, and then we're here and we say we can't do it now because we haven't signaled. When do we start signaling that
So
this is really happening?
in past years, we put an enormous amount of education policy reform into the yield bill and made a decision this year to keep them separate, to say this year is this year and next year is next year. And we have an omnibus education reform bill that I think we've done a lot of work on in this committee, and we are going to get back to next week. And we're going to need to focus all of our energies on it next week. And the education committee has done nothing but that this year. So we're keeping the bill separate, which I understand to some degree muddies the issue because it does not entirely signal in a single bill that change is happening the following year. It also makes it possible for us to manage some of these conversations that we need to have that are somewhat discrete. And so the yield bill we have before us is just to fund the budgets that are passed. My budget passed last night. Feeling good about that. It's to fund the budgets for the next year that have already, for the most part, been warned and voted, and we have a responsibility to fund those. So I heard from folks, homestead should move at the same speed. I think there's the question still of the 77, if we want to split it, if we want to spend it all in 1 year, if we want to spend it at all. I think that is sort of the one choice that feels to me that's still for us to decide. And I'm going to ask everyone to sit on that overnight, and that will be what we focus on tomorrow. Okay. Thank you. Anything else on yield bill? Okay, we are going to take another
Are we still ahead of schedule?
So we're not ahead of schedule. It's, we need to take a little break so our brains don't break. We're gonna take a 10-minute break.